No time for an intro today, so we'll get right to it. Friends, I hope you had a great weekend. It's Mike from Go Cell Phone Repair here to talk about some things that have been happening in the technology world. We're going to start this off with another exploding battery lawsuit, this time an iPhone 6. Shocker, I know, but it's weird that we don't hear as much about the iPhone exploding batteries as we do with most brands. I wonder what that's about. The European Union aims to abolish planned obsolescence. That will be an interesting one. Will all three iPhones have a Face ID built into them next September when they're released? Probably is my guess, but we'll talk about that. 10 years left for lithium ion batteries, so those scientists better get working on a solution, or we're going to be experiencing some problems when it comes to rechargeable devices, electric cars, and things along those lines. Pi's FCC says that 25 megabits per second, that's fast enough. That's broadband. I mean, how fast do you really need your internet to be, right? And Alcatel has a new budget phone. Let's talk some tech. Hey, Karl Harvey, good to see you. We didn't see you on here last week. Hope everything is going well for you guys. And I have just had all kinds of stuff going on. I'm doing training starting tomorrow, so Thursday's live stream hopefully will happen at the usual time. I'm not 100%, but it's been crazy around here. And I would encourage any of you who are in the phone repair business, even if you don't want to become a if you don't want YouTube to be what you do, that's cool. But it certainly works as a good way of promoting your business and kind of showing people what you do. So for all the cell phone repair people out there, again, your goal doesn't have to be to have a huge YouTube channel, but if you create some videos that show what you're doing and you point some links to your website in the description, I am confident that you will find people in your area who will discover you through search engines. And that's what's kind of cool about Google, is that if you have any type of multimedia outside of just written information about your business, that is going to help drive some traffic there. And that has absolutely been happening to me and a lot of other people that I know. So certainly something to consider if you're trying to get more people to bring you some phones to repair and other stuff. So we are going to look at this to start off with. I thought this was kind of interesting because it's been happening for quite a while with different companies, and we all know that eventually any lithium ion battery cell is going to start releasing gases and they expand inside and so forth, and that's not a big shocker. And I don't know, I don't see Nate there, but Nate sent me a video that was quite entertaining about a phone in China that caught on fire on the car's dashboard. And I'll try to find that video and put the link down in the description below this video, like all of the other sources here that we're talking about, so that you know I'm not just making this stuff up. I'm telling you where I got the information from. This is Cult of Mac, and they talk about a man in South Carolina who wants to sue or is suing Apple over an exploding iPhone 6. The irony to me is that just this Saturday, I published a video showing the inside of a phone, an iPhone 6 Plus, that had been issued as a replacement device. So someone bought one of those insurance plans or protection plans or whatever it is that you want to call it from their phone carrier. And when they had problems with their phone, it was damaged, lost, stolen, got wet, whatever it was, they take the phone or they make a claim and they say, hey, I'm paying X amount of dollars per month, and I'm sure that they pay a deductible in order to get a replacement unit. Well, the question is, what exactly do you get? And a lot of people, if you don't take the time to read the fine print, what you will discover when you make a claim is that you're not going to get a brand new phone. And in most cases, that will be that's what's gonna happen regardless of where you go. Even if you go to a manufacturer and you have some sort of insurance, oftentimes what they'll say is, here is a replacement handset, and they don't like the term refurbish. I think they have a different terminology that they use for it. But long story short, you can imagine no insurance company is going to stay in business for very long if they give you a brand new handset every time you have a problem with yours. That would be something like a car manufacturer giving you a brand new car when your transmission failed, instead of replacing that under warranty. So the downside here is that they generally don't take your phone in, repair it, and then give it back to you. They take your phone in, put that in the pile to be repaired, and then they hand you someone else's phone that's already been reconditioned, refurbished, rejuvenated, whatever term you want to use for it. They fixed another phone that had a problem. You don't really know the history of that phone, right? So that's problem number one. So on Saturday, I published a video showing one of the strangest things I've ever seen done inside of a phone by an insurance company, I assume, and that is they applied some sort of material that looked like hot glue, and Arthur King actually gave me another link and said it was probably this other stuff. And they kind of just squirted it around the Mason chip on the inside, which is where a touch disease problem comes from. So ironically, just a day later, I find this news story about a guy who took his phone in. Now, in the case of the iPhone I was working on, I don't know who the company was, so I can't tell you. I have no idea who that customer was dealing with. But in this one, they actually named the insurance company that this guy got his phone replaced by before it exploded in his pocket. So the incident actually occurred in 2016. So I don't know why we're just seeing the story now. Maybe because the lawsuit is actually moving forward, or he's gone public with it, or whatever happened. But apparently Robert Portee, the man in question, claims that he was visiting his son's house when he felt extreme heat and heard his clothes crackling. He had been charging his iPhone 6 and speaking on it just prior to the incident. Portee seeks unspecified damages from Apple and from insurance company Asusion. Now, Asusion does deal with quite a few of the carriers in the United States, so they're a pretty big name when it comes to phone insurance companies. It is, if you're making a claim through an insurance company that does business with your carrier, there's a good chance that it's Asusion. I'm sure that there is someone else out there offering the same service, but in this case, they do name Apple, obviously, and they name Asusion. He received the iPhone 6 as a replacement after his previous handset sustained damage. So this was not his original phone that he got back. Like I said, he gave them his phone, which he knew, what it had been through up to that point. And then he gets this replacement where there's just a very questionable history behind, what did this phone go through? How old is it exactly? How much wear and tear was on it? How much usage? What did you do to refurbish it? We really don't know the answer to that question, and neither does the customer. He received the iPhone 6. The iPhone, and what he says here is that he thinks that iPhones should notify their users if they're overheating. And in some cases they do to an extent, but there's not really a mechanism in there that would be anything equivalent to an alarm to tell you, hey, your phone's getting too hot, your battery's going to explode. And chances are, I don't suspect that you would have enough time for, from the point when it starts to heat up to the point when the battery can actually burst into flames. There probably wouldn't really be enough time for that warning to take place. But his problem, of course, is that if you're going to sell a phone, or someone is going to replace a phone and they're working on it, they refurbish it, whatever it is that they do, you certainly shouldn't have to worry about it exploding in your pocket. Now, what happened? Is it a bad battery? Is it the way that the battery was installed? Is this just a freak incident? We really don't know. Considering that there are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of certainly in the world, there are billions of lithium ion batteries out there. So occasionally there's going to be something that goes wrong with a few of them. And one of the big problems that we have with lithium ion is that it can be, under certain circumstances, quite unstable and cause a lot of problems like explosions and fires to happen. So who is really at fault here? Is it Apple for not having some safeguards built into the phone so that an exploding battery is preventable, which I don't think is really possible, right? And is it Asurion's fault for using some sort of substandard battery when they did the replacement on his phone? We don't really know the answer to that, and I really don't suspect that that's the case. I don't think that Asurion went and got some really garbage batteries. I mean, who knows, they might have, but we do know that these kind of things happen on occasion, and the real question is, what can we do to prevent this in the future? You just don't, if you've got your phone on the charger and you leave the room and it bursts into flames in your house, there's going to be some serious problems to deal with. So I really don't know what the answer here is, and whether or not we hold, or he can hold Asurion or Apple liable for this problem. The same way that if you were walking around in a grocery store and you slipped and you injured yourself, if the grocery store had taken steps to put up the wet floor sign around where the slippery surface was and you still slipped on it, are they liable? Is it negligence on their part? I believe that that is questionable, but definitely something you want to be concerned about if you have a battery in your pocket or sitting on your nightstand that could potentially burst into flames, right? Let's see, Harvey wanted to give my 2 cents on last week's 3D printed gun debacle. Oh, good. Let's talk about that for a minute. I'm going to try to squeeze all these in as fast as possible, as usual. 3D prints of any material are impractical. It takes hours, even days, for a high-resolution print. Even then, it is extremely brittle. Okay, interesting. So, point taken, Harvey. I think the real question was whether or, the big debate is whether or not people should be able to download 3D printable guns, practical or not, even if they're not going to work. The concern here is that having a plan for a 3D gun sort of circumvents the whole process of acquiring a gun permit, a firearm permit, any type of licensing. There's no way to track the weapon at that point. And even if it's in the infancy stages now, whatever they decide in this case going forward is going to set some sort of precedent. So the question around that was, if, let's say that 3D printing evolves and eventually you can print out a firearm that works, that's not going to be brittle, you can fire bullets with it and everything's fine. At that point, we need something to refer back to and say, hey, is this already okay? Is it legal or is it not? And probably the bigger question is it even preventable? Because if you can go online and download a plan for something, there's no real way for anyone to keep track of that. Nobody knows where that information is, who actually printed it out, and therefore who has this weapon. And, regardless of which side of the gun debate you might be on, there's probably an argument, I think, on both sides at this point that if you want gun regulation, then certainly you want to know who has these 3D printed guns. And even if you are pro-gun, one would assume that law enforcement probably wants to know if someone does have a gun or does not have a gun, as far as being registered or licensed. And I realize that a lot of people are going to have guns anyways. But if this gets very widespread and people think, oh, anyone with this 3D printer can get a gun, you don't have to worry about where it is, probably what will happen is in the future, anytime there is a warrant served or a no-knock raid or any of this kind of stuff, they are going to automatically assume that the person inside of that residence or a car or wherever it is may possibly have one of these guns, and that's the thing that we don't want everyone walking around thinking, I don't think, that, they're about to be shot at. We don't want law enforcement always feeling on edge. I mean, they're probably in that state already. But if you took this a step further and said, hey, it's possible that probably everywhere you go, people have guns. Has that already happened? Maybe that doesn't matter at this point. But the question was really, the guy came forward and said, hey, I think people should be able to have access to this. And really what happens a lot of times when it comes to laws is that if it's not enforceable, it's going to be very difficult to prevent it from happening. So even if now those guns are not really a threat or a danger to anyone, ultimately, I think, if they can print pipe wrenches that actually work and they don't fall apart when you're turning a huge, taking a huge nut off of a screw or something like that, I would think that they would come up with a gun, a material that would make a solid gun. I really don't know the physics part of that. You would think once you fired that thing, it'd probably fall apart, but I really don't know if that's the case or not. As far as the battery that exploded, Harvey, that was an iPhone 6. So this is at the top of the deal here. So suing Apple over an exploding iPhone 6. Def Palms Repair Channel. Hey, welcome to the stream. I had the choice of iPhone 6, 6S, or 7. When it was time to update from i5, I went with the 6S because I didn't like the issues with the 6 had with bending and touch disease, and I agree completely. They certainly took care of most of that problem by reinforcing the frame, made the phone slightly heavier, slightly thicker, but I was of the same philosophy. I did not want an iPhone 6. As soon as I heard about the bending problems, it's like, yeah, no, that's not going to be a good thing. And they fixed most of that with the 6S. And the interesting thing is, I don't know about your experience, but we certainly see a lot more iPhone 6s still to this day coming in for repair than we do iPhone 6S. If it's anything outside of a screen repair, it's still the iPhone 6s that we see a lot of. And I think that bending problem probably has a lot to do with that. And the 7 not having the headphone jack, which I use all the time, which I'm very disappointed about because I had an iPhone 7 for a long time without a headphone jack, and I don't use it that often, but I lost the ability to use like my Square card reader, and having a backup when your Bluetooth headset suddenly dies and you don't want to stop your workout and you've got your wired headphones in your pocket that you can just plug in. Now you got to fish for your dongle and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, that was kind of lame. Hey, what's going on, Nate? How are you? I was going to ask you if you had figured out that iPad 2 issue by any chance that we were talking about last week. I'd be more afraid of 3D printed knives, easier and faster to print. Harvey, your comment came up there 3 times, but I got you. 3D printed knives, that's a good point. We may have to worry about that. All right, so on that note, speaking of lithium ion batteries, I did change things a bit as far as the order goes here because I think this is a better transition. What we are looking at right now, let's go back up here to the top, Mike, is according to this article, and this is nature.com, it says reserves of cobalt and nickel used in electric vehicle cells will not meet future demand. We've been talking about this for a while. And interesting in this article, I did a little more digging and looking around, and while we get a lot of lithium ion batteries from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they have some problems with child labor and tracking where the cobalt is actually coming from that they mine, Australia is one of the other places where there's quite a bit of cobalt to mine, but they're not really mining a lot of it at this point. And then we know that in Idaho now they've got at least one Canadian company that set up shop and is going to start mining cobalt here in the U.S. But that being said, we're still looking at 10 to 20 years from now, especially when we're building electric vehicles that take these huge lithium ion batteries, which to this day, the technology coming from the early 90s, Sony back in like 91 started this whole lithium ion battery trend, got everyone to move away from nickel cadmium and nickel metal hydride. And the problem is that the materials that we need to make these things, we don't have like an unlimited supply of at this point, and we certainly don't have stockpiles of it to use for manufacturing. So the pace of advance is slowing as conventional technology approaches fundamental limits. This is another problem. We've been making improvements in lithium ion battery technology as far as how much of a charge they can hold, but it's getting to the point where the gains are becoming much smaller, and we're literally running out of room for how much better can we make lithium ion batteries. Like, they've just about peaked out when it comes to performance. The amount of charge that can be stored in gaps within the crystalline structures of electrode materials is nearing the theoretical maximum. So unless there's some new breakthrough technology for lithium ion batteries, this is about as good as they get right now, which, a lot of people would say is not all that great. Surging battery production has almost quadrupled wholesale prices of cobalt over the past 2 years, from $22 to $81 per kilogram. Sorry, I can't convert that for you. I don't know metric, but you get the point. Going from 22 to 81, that is a huge increase in price. High demand and prices are already encouraging some producers to cut corners and violate environmental and safety regulations. We also talked about this a few weeks back. In China, dust released from graphite mines has damaged crops and polluted villages and drinking water. In Africa, some mine owners exploit child workers and skimp on protective equipment such as respirators. Some companies, including BMW and supposedly Apple, follow strict policies to verify their cobalt suppliers. Many do not. The problem that we know about this, though, is that even if you verify the supplier, you don't really, when it comes down to it, the stuff that's coming out of the Congo, there's not a lot of paperwork involved. It's like a truck shows up and says, hey, we got this cobalt, here it is, and they aren't really able to track this all the way back to the mine where it came from. So if you have concerns about child labor, this is kind of iffy as far as they're really being able to go back and trace this and make sure that labor laws and things like that are being followed to mine this stuff. But that's not even the big problem, or that is a big problem, but another problem, I should say, is that they're running out of cobalt. In our view, and again, this is nature.com, the most promising candidates involve conversion materials such as copper or iron fluorides and silicon. So there are other ways to manufacture these batteries without using the current materials, which specifically cobalt is one of the ones that we're running into supply problems with. These store lithium ions by bonding chemically with them, but the technology is not fully developed right now. So long story short, this isn't going to happen right away. We know that these things, especially the cobalt, is scarce and expensive. Few cobalt mineral deposits are concentrated enough to be worth mining. This is another problem. There is cobalt, but it's not concentrated in areas where you can really justify the cost that it takes to acquire the materials. The Democratic Republic of the Congo supplied more than half, and to be more precise, 56% of the 148,000 tons of the metal mined worldwide in 2015, and I assume that figure is similar. I don't know. They don't really specify on here. Now, as far as projected shortfalls, if nothing changes, demand will outstrip production within 20 years, which seems realistic. You know, it was one thing when we were manufacturing small electronic devices, but now that we're seeing more and more electric cars, that, you know, granted there aren't as many people who own electric cars, but look at the difference in the size and the battery cells for these things. We expect this to occur for cobalt by 2030 and for nickel by 2037 or sooner. So we're talking 10 to 20 years, and that is about it if they don't come up with an alternative or some new technology. And it's interesting that we've been using lithium ion for so long without any other breakthrough, you know, appearing, and people just saying, oh, there's something way better, because you kind of think by now that there would be, right? I mean, we certainly need it. I used to record Def Palms. Okay, I want to say Def Palms. Def Palms Repair Channel. I used to record video for my channel on my iPhone. I only changed to a proper camera a few months ago, so I used the jack for external mic. Yeah, it's frustrating. I don't know what to say. You know, if you want an iPhone, what's the last model that you can get? An iPhone 6S or the SE, I suppose, which I think seems like they've done away with the whole idea of an SE2. Nate, I have not had any luck with the iPad. Talked to Chris Long, suggested PMIC repair and replace, but I don't think I'm going to. Yeah, and that's what sucks is I've seen so many but yours was an iPad Air 2, if I remember correctly. I've been seeing so many iPad Air first gens just die for no apparent reason, and in all likelihood, they're going back to the power management chip. And I want to say, though, Nate, that the good thing about the iPad Air 2 is that, or was it an iPad 2? I'm sorry, that conversation was like last week. The PMIC on the first gen iPad Air is ridiculous. It's $85, and I want to say that the second gen is like $35. So it's, you know, $50 difference for a newer power management chip, and I don't understand why that is. But when I talk to a customer and I say, okay, you got $85 for the PMIC if we can replace it, and then labor on top of that, and at that point it's kind of like, unless it's a data recovery job, yeah, they're not as motivated really to get the repair done. Harvey says, that's why we're getting a Space Force. Need to mine for meteorites and comets. Hey, you know, there's a lot of there's much truth to that, Harvey, and before I get real sidetracked, I'm going to stop myself, but I listened to an interesting podcast where they were talking about how not only Elon Musk's SpaceX program, but also the program that Amazon's, is he the founder, the CEO, the president, Jeff Bezos, actually has a similar program underway for traveling into space. And there's an idea that really all that's missing is for NASA or the government or someone else to fund part of this program so that they will in fact be able to go to these meteors and start mining materials. So they're already putting together the transportation part of it, but there are some other missing pieces that need to come into play, and a lot of people are kind of wondering like why this isn't already happening. And then there are, you know, suspicions as to people who are providing energy and materials now obviously don't want a lot of competition. You know, there's kind of a closed market. It's here on Earth, so once we start traveling to space, and we can get, you know, we've got meteorites that are like covered with diamonds and all sorts of different ores that we have limited supplies here. There could be a lot of political reasons behind why that's not actually happening yet, but I suspect that it is the future. How far in the future, we don't really know, right? Usually it's necessity will dictate how soon we make it happen, but it certainly would make sense if we could travel to an asteroid on one of these reusable spacecrafts, set up a mining operation, and then bring that stuff down to Earth. And I hope that I'm still alive when that happens. I think it's inevitable, but we'll just have to see when exactly, right? Years ago, had an iPhone 4 where the battery expanded and pushed the screen off. Must have been close to catching fire. Yeah, we see a lot of those, where it's literally just bulging out the screen from the phone, and the customer's like, yeah, I tried to push it back. No, don't push it back down in there, right? But that's the thing about them. You kind of think that lithium ion batteries would be vented in some way, but I suppose they wouldn't work properly if that was the case. So I don't know what the answer is on that one, but definitely used to seeing it. All right, so next up we have the European Union, who aims to abolish planned obsolescence. Now, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot on this article, so I do want to say up front that I only found one source for this information, and that doesn't make me particularly skeptical about this article, but once I see something in the news and only one source has published it, I always wonder why that is. So maybe it's because no, that wouldn't make sense. This was on May 7th. So this popped up in my feed yesterday, but it was actually published on May 7th, and if there's no one else out there talking about it yet, I suspect nothing else has happened, unfortunately. But I like the idea. It kind of makes sense. And taking a look at how things work and how heavily influenced we are here by big business interests, it makes a lot of sense that someone outside of the US would probably spearhead this type of effort. So the European Parliament now wants the European Commission to create to create a clear definition of the term planned obsolescence. And as I say that, I see they have a link here, so I should probably take a look at that. It is on the same website though, so that doesn't really convince me much more. Let's go back to this article, Mike. Kind of lost my spot there. Oh, and oh, good, it kept them. Okay, so develop a system to track that aging process. Devices should also be easier to repair, they say. I believe most of us are in agreement on this one. Batteries and other components should be freely accessible for replacement unless safety dictates otherwise. I'm not sure exactly what that means. And at the same time, I certainly think that they make it much more difficult than it needs to be for repair. We need access to the right parts. We need access to the right information to perform a repair properly. Otherwise, we get to figure it out on our own. And at the same time, I think that we all need to keep in mind that if phones were super easy to repair, then a lot of us would be out of work. So we don't want to take it to a level where we squeeze out innovation to make room for repairability, right? I mean, we don't want things to be slowed down. We don't want progress to slow because manufacturers are having to obey so many rules that prevent them from changing design, from including certain features and so forth. So there's certainly a happy balance in there somewhere, I think. But in order to have a battery sealed inside of a phone to where it can explode and it can catch on fire, or it can make the screen pop off of the device, seems somewhat kind of ridiculous to me. And we know that the big thing here is that water resistance, water resistance, water resistance. Well, that's why it's hard to get your battery out, right? At least that's what they tell us. Well, there are a few phones that aren't too easy to get the battery out of, and they don't have a very good, if any, water resistance rating. So I'm skeptical about that one as well, but we certainly have to have these things sealed up if we don't want water to get inside, unless you take a design like Samsung where, the battery is still accessible in the S5 and it was water resistant. Not the best water resistant design, but it was functional when the phone was not damaged and the charge port wasn't damaged and so forth. So I think it's still possible to make a replaceable battery and have your water resistance, but I don't suspect that many manufacturers would be in favor of that, at least at this point. The European Parliament also hopes the resolution would stimulate job creation because it should result in more independent repair services. Hey, that would be cool, right? So again, this article's been out here for a while. There's not a lot, as far as, to my knowledge at least, as far as what's happening, but I'm glad that somebody is stepping up and saying, you know what, it's not okay to make something that you buy and it's automatically, we suspect in many cases, it's automatically going to stop working after a certain amount of time. It doesn't seem like a good idea, and the argument is always, well, if you don't like it, you don't have to buy it, vote with your wallet and so forth. But if we do that, then we certainly need enough competition in the marketplace that we don't have a monopoly or a duopoly on whatever the product happens to be. So I think there's a lot of open questions here that we need to consider and talk about, but not surprisingly, this is happening in Europe and not here for a number of reasons. Too bad there isn't an iPhone that uses 18650 batteries. What? What is that? What is an 18650 battery, Harvey? Do I have to look that up? Because I don't know. Let's search in Google and see what it says. IMR batteries. I have not heard about this. Okay, they are selling batteries. Okay, so these are the regular AA, AAA cells. I'm going to have to look that up, Harvey, because I'm not familiar with that technology. But anything that improves would be welcome at this point. All three of Apple's 2018 iPhones may, don't you love that? They may, well, they may not too, but we think that the 2018 iPhone lineup will probably have Face ID in all of the models, which means goodbye to Touch ID. And I'm sure that a few people are disappointed by that. And I'm a little surprised because when they started with the iPhone 10 and built the Face ID in, there were a lot of people who liked it, and there were a lot of people who were thrilled by emojis and being able to personalize their messages and that kind of thing. But one of the biggest complaints that I heard from customers is that they missed their Touch ID. They didn't like holding the phone up to their face. It didn't work all the time. In the morning, it wasn't as good as at night. If they're wearing a pair of glasses or they're outside and it was bright, they were having all sorts of trouble unlocking the phone. And they were saying that, yeah, I'd really just like to have my Touch ID. I love the iPhone 10, but I want Touch ID back. And we have reason to believe that's not going to happen, which will be interesting. I don't think that it's going to hurt Apple's sales much. It doesn't seem like they can do anything wrong at this point, so I'm sure people will still buy their handsets. But as far as we know, a company called Lumentum is Apple's, the manufacturer for the Face ID hardware. So Apple's key iPhone 10 augmented reality component supplier, Lumentum, Lite, reported better than expected June 18 quarter results. Loop Venture writes, given the expected ramp in VCSEL arrays, and that is vertical cavity service emitting lasers. So if you like having laser beams shot at your face, which is pretty much how it works, we believe this fall Apple will offer 3 iPhone models up from one today that include AR 3D sensing. So of course the iPhone, the new version of the iPhone 10, the upgraded bigger version, and then something smaller that we think is may be called the iPhone 9, which will be funny if it is, because we had the iPhone 10 last year, the iPhone 9 this year. No one really knows for sure, of course, until launch date, unless you believe all the rumors. And again, on this one, not a lot in the way of information. Pretty much what I said, that we're expecting a spiffed up, probably faster processor. And other than that, I don't know what else for the iPhone 10, a larger 10 Plus and a lower cost model that may or may not have an LCD. I suspect that it will. We'll have to see, of course. Let's see. Yeah, so this thing, I don't know how big of a selling point the whole emoji thing is. And certainly most of us could live without the notch. I don't think this is going to sell the phone, but I am surprised that they are moving away from the fingerprint. If they do move away from the fingerprint completely, I don't know if that is a good move, because again, it just doesn't seem, I'm certainly not unlocking my phone with my face. I haven't even got to the point where I'm comfortable with the fingerprint scanner yet, so I'm good with the passcode. And I suppose if you have Face ID, you can just input the passcode anyways, right? So how can I complain? Yeah, we'll see. Now, does this mean that there will not be a physical home button on any of the iPhones? That is my question, because we assume that as far as the iPhone 10 series and the iPhone 10 Plus or whatever it is going to be called, we won't be seeing a home button. That's not what we're thinking, right? But as far as this lower end model that has an LCD screen, if it has Face ID and no Touch ID, will they in fact do away with the home button completely? Because that would be interesting. And I kind of suspect that they might, only because the way that Apple approached this, sort of dipping their toes into the water, if you will, with the iPhone 10 and saying, you know what, we're going to have this brand new iPhone with all this cool stuff on it and no more home button. And all of you who love the home button, well, it's outdated. It's time to move on. Get over it. And I think that most people did. So again, for anyone who is a loyal Apple customer, I suspect that it would take quite a bit in the way of removing features and changing functionality before those customers said, okay, that's it, I don't want an iPhone anymore. Because mainly because of the operating system. You know, if you manufacture the hardware and the software, and you've got people who like the interface, they like the user interface of iOS, you could probably throw just about anything at them and they're going to tolerate it, if not embrace the new technology that they're using. So I guess we will see when that happens, right? So besides that, I want to talk about the broadband standards that the FCC is proposing. You know that you all know that I feel strongly about this. I would like for the internet to remain free and open and unthrottled and be able to watch whatever sort of entertainment I want. I would like for people to see me on YouTube and not be penalized because I'm not sold by their, because their cable company doesn't own YouTube or Netflix or any other streaming source. We shouldn't have to say you're going to pay more for this, less for that. And in some markets are already doing some goofy stuff. So as I predicted, it's not going to be an overnight change where net neutrality goes away and all of a sudden everyone's ISP starts doing terrible things that the public can see happening immediately and react to. It's going to be a very slow transition where they have reasons for doing things and they're probably going to swap out a few features and give you something else to make up for it and make it seem like you're getting a great deal or you should sign a new contract to upgrade to whatever. But this one's a little difficult to sweep under the rug, I think. So Ajit Pai says that 25 megabits per second is fast enough to be considered broadband. If you're streaming to YouTube, I can assure you that their upload speed, let me read a bit of the article here. So the Federal Communications Commission is proposing to maintain the U.S. broadband standard at the current level of 26 megabits per second downstream, 3 megabits per second upstream. You cannot live stream to YouTube, for example, with 3 megabit upstream speeds. It's not going to happen. And in fact, one of the things that really irritates me about this is when they say what they have to do here. There's a reason. They have got to say that they offer broadband service to a certain percentage of the country in order to prevent regulation from happening. So this is the big problem behind this. So if any provider cannot give the population in the area that they service broadband speeds, then that opens up the door for competition because we need someone to come in who can. Or, plan B would be that the FCC or some other government organization would step in and say, hey, you're not delivering the service that people need, so you either need to do that or you need to make it possible for someone else to do that. Well, the way that they're sort of making this sufficient is by redefining what broadband speed is. So if I say that I need 100 megabits per second download to do business for what I do, and I don't get that from my provider, then it would be, theoretically, someone could come in and offer that as a competing service, or a government agency could come in and say, hey, you're not offering broadband to this customer. So how do you get around that? You redefined what broadband speeds are. And when they say 25 megabits downstream, 3 megabits per second upstream, I want to mention for the record that these are like the mileage ratings on a lot of automobiles, but even worse. So if it says you're going to get up to 26 megabits per second download, that does not mean you're going to get that speed all the time. It does not really mean that you're going to get that speed at all. In my case, I'm supposed to be getting 25 megabits per second upstream. I am usually lucky if I get 11 or 12, which is just enough to do this stream. So, the numbers that they throw out here in many cases aren't even accurate in my experience. The FCC raised the standard from 4 megabits and down and 1 megabit upstream in January of 2015. So they used to think that 4 megabits per second download, I'm at 400 right now, okay? In 2015, as recently as 3 years ago, they were defining 4 megabits per second download speeds as being broadband, and they upgraded that to 25.3 under the chairman at the time, Tom Wheeler. Ajit Pai, who was then a commissioner in the FCC's Republican minority, voted against raising the speed standard. Surprise, surprise. This is the guy that used to work for Verizon. So not a big shocker there. But reason for concern, in my opinion. Democratic Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, this is what she said. The inquiry fundamentally errs by proposing to keep our national broadband standard at 25 megabits per second. It is time to be bold and move the national broadband standard from 25 megabits to 100 megabits per second. When you factor in price at this speed, the United States is not even close to leading the world. And there are a number of reasons for that. We do know that in countries, for example, South Korea, where they kind of waited to implement fiber until it was up and running, figured out, they knew how it worked, and then they went in and laid their infrastructure. So they started out with ridiculous speeds compared to what we have, but they had to wait a lot longer to get it than we did initially. But the fact that we're falling behind in this standard is something that we should probably be concerned with. If you had gone back to 2015, before they raised this standard, and your download speed was 4 megabits per second, you were probably not watching Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or possibly even YouTube, at least at decent resolution. So as we get more advanced when it comes to multimedia, to video and audio and gaming and stuff like this, we have to have something that supports those speeds. And when a company comes in and for all practical purposes has a monopoly on that internet connection, if we don't hold them responsible for giving us access to the speeds that we need to do business or to play games or watch programming or whatever it is that we have that we're using now, the same way that we do with any utility company, and this is also a big arguing point. ISPs do not want to be considered utility companies because if they are, then they are regulated by the federal or state government. Whereas if you look at something like electricity, gas, sewage, water, things like that, they have to be regulated because these are things that in this day and age we consider to be something essential to survival. You have to have electricity in your house, right? I mean, you could have a fireplace, I guess, maybe a generator outside and create your own electricity, but we've all kind of come to the conclusion that electricity is a public utility. It's something that people should all have access to in their homes if they live within the city limits. So at some point, I think that we've got to acknowledge that a broadband connection is so prolific that it has become something that Americans should have access to in their homes, and it shouldn't be possible for big companies to say, well, we're the only choice, but we're not going to give you the type of service that you want, because if that's what's going to happen, then we're going to have the same type of regulations, I would assume, at some point in time. Although they will probably fight it all the way, and why wouldn't they? Let's see. Let's go back here. While Pi's proposal, let's see, lost my place there. While Pi's proposal isn't yet finalized, keeping the current speed standard would likely mean that the FCC will conclude that broadband deployment is already happening fast enough throughout the US. Pi could use that conclusion in attempts to justify further deregulation of the broadband industry. So we already lost net neutrality. I'm not sure what's next, but if he can come out and say we've satisfied the requirement for broadband connections throughout the market, then they can probably start taking away more consumer protections because, hey, we did our job. You have your 25 megabit download speeds. Everybody's happy, right? Well, unless your name is Mike and you're trying to stream on YouTube. So public comments due next month. I don't know that this will matter. We saw what the FCC did last time people commented on how they felt about repealing net neutrality. They said, well, we don't care. And we've been hacked, and just recently acknowledged that they were not in fact hacked. But when it gets to the point that what the people want is completely ignored by those who vote on the regulations, what do you do? I mean, do you go out in the street and protest? Few people are in a bad enough situation right now where that would be something to even consider. There are certainly more important things going on in the world than someone's broadband connection, right? So we're not going to see protests about this. These changes seem to be continuing gradually, and I'm concerned about the future of the internet in the United States anyways. It's unfortunate. U.S. law defines advanced telecommunications capability as service that enables users to originate and receive high-quality voice, data, graphics, and video telecommunications using any technology. Really? Well, tell that to the FCC. So I'm not sure what happens here, and the biggest concern is not streaming on YouTube or watching Netflix. The biggest concern is that little by little, if ISPs start to favor their own media outlets and penalize people for looking at alternatives to information, outside of what they have. So, hey, if you want to watch Comflix, instead of Netflix, you get it for free. And if you want Netflix, you have to pay extra. Otherwise, we're going to throttle the speed. So you are pushed towards a platform that is provided by a business that has corporate interests who sponsor their content. Pretty soon you end up with something not unlike Fox or CNN or any of these other broadcast companies that are owned by their sponsors, and they're owned by the people who support them and who lobby for certain agendas. And that's where it all gets scary, because the great thing about the internet was that we could all communicate freely. And with what's going on lately, especially, it seems like there's a lot of, if you want to call it censorship, there are penalties, there are people whose accounts are being taken down and closed and labeled as being controversial or hateful or who knows what. And I'm certainly opposed to propagating hate speech or anything along those lines, but we certainly need to be careful when we start saying, well, this person can talk, but this other one can't. Well, why not? At one point we had a protection of free speech, and I realized that on a private platform, we're not guaranteed those same protections. But when something reaches a scale where it is the go-to place to view something or to search for something or to watch your entertainment, then we have to start wondering if we don't need those same types of protections so that someone who has a specific political agenda doesn't take over and become the dominating influence, on one side or the other or wherever it is they happen to be. That's my real concern. It's not about streaming on YouTube. It's not about watching, playing video games or watching streaming video. It's about being able to access information. And this is what concerns me the most about this whole loss of net neutrality and what's happening with these big ISPs. So anyways, I don't want to end on that. That's some doom and gloom stuff right there. Let's see, where were we here? Hey, Carl, Joshua, how are you? 28.8 is the new broadband. Wow, I remember when I got my 56K modem and it was smoking. It was so fast. And now we have ridiculous internet speeds. I hope we do the right thing with them. So, like I said, I don't want to end on sadness or anything depressing like that. It's unfortunate. But here's something interesting, and I was wondering what was going to happen, because if we're squeezing out Huawei and ZTE and potentially a lot of other Chinese manufacturers from the U.S. market for whatever reasons and through whatever means, which is generally, if the carriers don't have the handsets in the store, customers are not really going to buy them. And if they're not advertising here, obviously that's going to make a difference. I was curious specifically about ZTE, because while Huawei really was, really is the up-and-comer now. I mean, they're talking about launching things that are going to be far more advanced than what Samsung has on the market right now. So for Android, some very interesting state-of-the-art technology that will be available outside of the US. What about ZTE, who was selling to the lower end, specifically to Metro? They had handsets that were inexpensive but had very large screens, and that's something that we've been trending towards for a long time, and people like the idea that they can get a huge screen and not spend a lot of money on it. And of course, if that screen breaks, you can almost buy another phone or get a very inexpensive replacement for the screen. Alcatel is a brand that we don't hear much about lately. They were a lot bigger back in probably the late 90s, or I'm going to say early 2000s, and then they just kind of faded into I don't know what. Like, we just don't see them around a lot. Well, they are launching a budget smartphone with a tall and slim 18:9 display. The Alcatel 7 costs $179.99 and is available exclusively with Metro PCS, aka T-Mobile, right? I mean, because it's pretty much the same network. So let's take a look at the specs here real quick. As you'd expect for the price, not the most exciting, but what do you want for $200 nowadays? It has a 2.5 gigahertz MediaTek processor, octa-core MT6763, 2 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of internal storage, which is probably the bare minimum nowadays, and yet a healthy 4,000 milliamp hour battery. That part sounds good. Dual rear-facing cameras, one 12 megapixel, one 2 megapixel, I'm sure, so that you can take those cool photos that look like you're focusing on one thing and everything else is blurry. That seems to be the new thing, which is cool if you're telling a story, but when you're trying to see details in the background, it's kind of annoying, but that's just my personal preference. A single 8 megapixel front-facing lens, also a fingerprint sensor, and the option of face unlock. I guess that thing really is catching on at this point. The most interesting feature, though, is Alcatel's decision to go with a 6-inch 2160 by 1080 display with an 18:9 ratio. This, the company claims, maximizes your screen space without unnecessary bulk. So this should be kind of cool. You know, if you're on T-Mobile or Metro and you just want a big, inexpensive, big screen, inexpensive phone, this might be something to consider. Now, when it comes to repairability, that part is questionable. Traditionally, we have worked on some Alcatels, but, you know, as of recent, I can't remember the last time I saw an Alcatel anything come into the store. And when I did, it's so far back, it was probably a flip phone style or some sort of clamshell. So I don't know, you know, how this is going to go over, but because we're not going to see ZTE and probably a lot of other manufacturers, this is something that, at least in Metro, will probably be a big deal, I think. Especially now that they have a fingerprint scanner and Face ID built into it. All right, guys, I have almost finished up, and we still have 8 minutes to spare. Isn't that amazing? So let's close this out right here. And I wanted to say, while we were talking about emojis and this Face ID stuff that Apple's doing, which is cool, you know, if you're interested. I mean, it's entertaining, right? You can see someone's face being animated and so forth. Every time I text someone, I want to ask where the sarcasm font is. Have you ever questioned? I mean, instead of if you type something out, let's say a paragraph long, and at the end of it you put /s, then your mind has to kind of think back and go, oh, that was sarcasm. There should have been a different type of inflection when I read that message, because when I read my messages, I don't generally read a question as a question unless I can see the question mark, if that makes sense. So if you're reading something that's more than a few lines wrong and you get to the end, a few lines long, you get to the end and then you see the /s and you go, oh, they were being sarcastic. Well, at that point, it's kind of like you heard the punchline and then someone tried to tell the joke, right? You want to know that that tonality is being sarcastic from the beginning. So there should be, if not a sarcasm font, maybe a sarcasm emoji that you put at the beginning of the text message, or I don't know, well, you know, maybe move that S to the front. I don't know how you would make that happen, but I think we need something like that. Great, more cheap phones going our way. Indeed. We are, you know, how many? Good question. I don't know. We have more cheap phones, but a lot of other cheap phones are going away, if that means anything. So what do you all think? What happened to my scroller here? Oh, well. I guess it's not going to work. All right, so that was about it. Any questions or comments, please put them into the chat. I am going to hang out here for another 7 minutes. How am I going to fill that time? I don't know. Why don't we look up the battery that Harvey was talking about, because I have never heard of this before, and I'm not sure I know exactly what it is, but I am curious. I mean, I'm not sure if it's exactly... let's see. Let's look at images. Can we do that without getting sued? Oh, Harvey, are you talking about the kind of batteries that come in cordless phones? Because that's kind of what it looks like. Like these dudes right here? Is that what that is? The type that they're using in vaporizers, I suspect. That's what it looks like. Let's look at the wiki. It's like going to the library or the... let's see, do we have a Wikipedia thing on this? Come on. Not help me here. Let's go battery and see what this is about. Here we go. 18650. This is a redirect to a topic that does not have its own page to a section of a page on the subject. Well, Harvey, if you know anything about it, you can update the wiki because they have nothing to talk about other than listing it under lithium ion batteries. And that was